Our next topic will be smart objects. And smart objects have the potential of completely changing the way you think about Photoshop depending on what you do. Now, in previous sections of Photoshop The Complete Guide, we've used smart objects. We used them once when we were applying filters. And so it's a very nice way of doing it. But let's jump in and really dig deep into the concept of a smart object. So I'm going to duplicate this image by going to the Image menu and choosing Duplicate. When I duplicate it, I'm going to call it Not Smart. So you know that that version is not going to utilize smart objects. Then we have two versions of that image open. I want to be able to see them side by side. So I'll go to the Window menu, choose Arrange, and choose To Up Vertical, which will show the images side by side. And at this point, I'm going to take the image on the right, and I'm going to go to the Layer menu, choose Smart Objects, and say Convert to Smart Object. Now when I do that, watch what happens in my Layers panel. If you look at the little thumbnail picture for that layer, and you look in the lower right corner of it, when I convert this to a Smart Object, you'll see an extra icon appear there. Now the first time you ever do that, you might get a little warning that comes up, and it just tells you something about if you need to edit the contents of this, to double click on the layer, just so you're aware. If something comes up the very first time you do that, there should be a Don't Show Again checkbox. I suggest you turn it on and click OK, because after this lesson, you'll be quite versed in smart objects. So now the image on the right is a smart object, the image on the left is not. They look the same, but they're not going to always act the same. Whenever you create a smart object, it is like taking your image and putting it into a protective sleeve. Imagine it's something like a Ziploc bag. And by putting it into a smart object, it's going to protect the original contents of that layer, so anything I do to it from now on will not be able to change the original contents. I can still change the look of the picture, but I always can get back to the original look. So first I'm going to work on the not smart version, and I'm going to unlock its little layer here because it's a background layer and there's only certain things I can do to the background. If I click the lock symbol though, I can do anything to it. And what I'd like to do here is first I'm going to apply a filter to this. And when I filter it, let's see, I'm going to come down and maybe just sharpen the image. And I'll kind of over sharpen it so it looks really sharp. Click OK. And if I zoom up on it and I choose Undo, you can see before and after it's over sharpened. Then I'm going to scale and rotate the picture. To scale and rotate something, usually I go to the Edit menu and I choose Free Transform, or I type the keyboard shortcut Command-T, Control-T in Windows. And I'm going to scale this really small, like that small. And I'll also rotate it and press Return or Enter to indicate that I'm done. Move it to the middle of my document. So if I zoom in, that's all we got. Then I'm going to do the same thing to the image on the right. That's the one that is a smart object. With that one, I'll go to the Filter menu. I'm going to sharpen it, and I'll apply Unsharp Mask. It looks like it's remembering the settings I used on the other one, so I'll just click OK. And then I'll go to the Edit menu and choose Free Transform. This is one of those things where you get a warning that you just choose Don't Show Again and click OK. And I'm going to make that again very, very small, much smaller than that. And I'll rotate it, press Return or Enter. So now we've done approximately the same thing to both images. I don't know if I have it exactly the same on both. I doubt it, but it's close enough. The main thing is the image on the left is not a smart object, and because of that, it does not remember what the old version of the image looked like, especially if I were to save this image, close it, and open it a month later. Sure, because right now I could choose Undo to get it back, but imagine it was saved and closed so that it doesn't retain any kind of a history. Well, now I'm going to take that image on the left, and let's say I didn't want it to be quite that small. So I'll go to the Edit menu, I'll choose Free Transform, and I'm going to attempt to scale it up. When I scale it up, it does not remember how much information it originally contained. So if I attempt to get this to fill the majority of my screen, it's not going to regain any of its quality. And if I attempt to straighten it, there's nothing that's going to help me make sure that it's perfectly straight and that it's not at like a 1 or 2 degree angle compared to what it was before. I'll get it up there, I'm going to press return or enter, and you'll see how terrible the results look. Take the image on the right, though, it's totally different because it's a smart object, which means the original contents of that layer are completely preserved. And everything I do to this image will always be calculated from the original contents of that smart object. What that means is when I go over here to edit and I choose free transform, first off, I doubt you can tell right now, but it's starting off differently. Do you notice that the transformation handles that are on this match the angle of this object? Whereas when I did it to the image on the left, they were straight. It never knew that I ever rotated the image in the past. But here with a smart object, it knows that I've rotated it, and if I look up here in my options bar, I can see what angle it's been rotated to. If I select the number for the angle and type in 0, then press return, that should straighten it out. So now it's back to the way it used to be. Also in the options bar, it tells me exactly what size this had been scaled to, and I could just select that and type in 100 and press return, and that's going to end up bringing this back to its original size, because the transformation I've applied is just thought of as a setting attached to the layer. It's not actually changing the true contents of that layer. And so I can always bring it back. But when I bring it back, I look at it and I'm like, that looks overly sharp, and I really wish I wouldn't have sharpened the image. Well, if you look in my layers panel, since this was a smart object, when I applied a filter, it was applied as what's known as a smart filter. And if I would like to remove the effect, I could either turn off this eyeball or just drag this to the trash, and I would see the version of it that's not sharpened. Or I can double click on the name of the filter that's in my layers panel, and it'll open up the sharpen screen here, and I could fine tune the settings to get it to be more appropriate for this image. Because anything I do to that file is not going to harm the original contents that was put into the smart object, and it'll always be calculated from that original contents. And therefore, I can easily scale it back up to original size, rotate it back, change any filters that have been applied. It's much more versatile, whereas the image on the left just looks terrible. So what that means is anytime you plan on combining multiple images together, let's say you're going to design a little layout that's going to show maybe 6 pictures, and you're going to scale them down and rearrange them in various areas, it would be best if you were to start with smart objects. Because then, let's say you scaled down those pictures and you started placing them side by side, and when you were done, you decided, well, they're a little too small. You want to scale them up to fit some more space. Well, if you do that and you don't have a smart object, anytime you scale things up, it's going to make your image look softer. And that's like what you're seeing on the left side of my screen. That's just an extreme example of it. But if it was a smart object, the quality would still be there. So let's start to try to explore some of the things we can do with smart objects that are special. Here is a logo for a book that I wrote many years ago. It was called Up to Speed because I wrote about only the new features of a program when they updated it. And so it would get you up to speed. And if you look here, this is made out of multiple layers. I have a layer here that just puts color in the word to. Here I have the actual white text. Below that, I have one that has some motion blur on it. Below that, this shape, and so on. Now, I didn't use smart objects when this was created because I didn't make it. But had I been there, I would have used smart objects. And if I had, then this layer that has a motion blur on it, which is, if I turn off some of these other layers, you'll see it right here. This has got the motion blur filter applied to it. Well, unfortunately, I can't tell what setting was used when the blur was applied, and if I think it's too much or not enough, I can't change it because it wasn't a smart object. If it was, I'd be able to. And let's just look at a few of the things I might do. Here, if I select one of these layers and I attempt to come up to the Edit menu, choose Transform, and choose a choice called Warp. You see that it's available here. That's because I only have one layer selected. But watch what happens when I select multiple layers. If I select all except for the layer that contains the red background, then I go to the Edit menu, choose Transform, notice that Warp is completely grayed out because Warp can only work on a single layer at once. Also, if I go here to the Filter menu, notice that every single filter is also grayed out because they can only apply to a single layer at a time. That is unless I first choose Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object. Now, if you have more than one layer selected at the time you do that, then it's going to look as if those layers have been merged together into a single layer. So watch my Layers panel, and you'll see all the layers that are currently selected suddenly become one, and that particular layer has that special icon in the corner to indicate it's a smart object. Now that I've done that, if I go to the Edit menu, I can choose Transform, and now Warp is available because what I'm working on looks to be a single layer. So Warp works just fine. Maybe I come up here and choose an unusual choice there just to get a little different look. Press Return or Enter. I can also go to the Filter menu, and every filter that's here is available. So if I wanted to do a motion blur on this, no problem whatsoever. So there are certain features within Photoshop where smart objects help because it allows you to apply things to multiple layers. But now, what if I decided I needed to make a change? Maybe I don't want the letters TO to have the color in it. I want them to be white. Well, if this was not a smart object, now how would I get in there and isolate just those two letters that are there and change their color to white? Well, this has got blurring on it and warping on it and everything else. Well, what happens is when you turn something into a smart object, it takes the original contents of whatever it was you had selected, and it does the equivalent to doing a save as, saving it as a separate file. You can access that separate file by double-clicking on the thumbnail image for a smart object. So if I double-click right here, another document is going to open, and it's going to contain the original layers that were put into that smart object. And so if here's my original layers, the topmost layer was the one that was changing the colors of the letters TO, and I'll just turn off the eyeball for that particular layer. Then if I close this file, I'll just click on the little X that's up here in the tab. It'll ask me, hey, would you like to save those changes? When it's saving the changes, it's not going to save them onto my hard drive. It's going to save them back to where they just came from. And if you think about when this document appeared, it appeared when I double-clicked on the thumbnail image for that smart object. So when I choose Save here, it doesn't mean save on my hard drive. It means save back into that layer that I was working on earlier. So I can choose Save, and now do you notice that the letters TO are now white? If I were to choose Undo by typing Command Z, you'll see that now they're back, or I will choose Reapply, and you see the change that I've made. Not only that, but the changes I've done as far as the warping goes and the filter that's been applied are also not permanent. Because if you look in my Layers panel, there I see the word Motion Blur. I can turn off its eyeball, and there it is without it. And I can go to the Edit menu. I can choose Transform and choose Warp. And all I need to do here is, if I look at this, there's a number up here. It says bend 50. I'll bring it down to 0. That means don't bend it with warping. And the only thing I'd need to do in addition to that is use my Move tool to move it back down. But those changes that I've made are just settings attached to the layer. And if I go back to the same source that created them, I can change the settings. I can change the amount of warping, in this case bringing it down to 0. Or in the case of motion blur, I could turn the eyeball back on next to it, and just double click on the name, motion blur, and I would be looking at the settings as if I never had left this to see what I can get. So a smart object, remember, is going to take, if you have multiple layers, and it's going to look like they got merged into one. What really happened is they got encapsulated into a separate document. It's a second document that is not a separate file on your hard drive. It's just embedded in that layer. And in order to get to the original contents, you double click on the thumbnail for the layer and it appears as a separate document, a separate window that you can make changes to. When you save it, it saves it right back into the layer it came from. And so that's how smart objects work. It takes a while for your brain to get around that, but let's look at a few other things related. Well, before I showed you that I wasn't able to warp more than one layer at a time because it was just grayed out. Same with filters. Well, sometimes there are other things that get messed up like that. In this case, I want to warp this. It's only one layer, so it should have no problem warping it. And if I go to the image menu, or sorry, the edit menu, choose transform, you see warp is available. But watch what happens when I warp this. I'm going to warp it, and you can warp it manually by dragging on these little handles, or you can come up here and just choose a preset, and then there's an amount called bend that allows you to bend it. But notice, when I warped this image, sure, the shape that was there got distorted. It used to be close to a square, and now it looks more like one of those Asian fans, but the pattern that had been applied to it did not get bent. It didn't get warped. So I'm going to choose undo, and let's look in our layers panel to see how this image is constructed. Well, here's a shape, and then attached to the shape is something called a pattern overlay. You add things like a pattern overlay by going to the bottom of your layers panel, clicking on the letters FX, and here's a long list of effects you can apply, like drop shadows. And one of those choices is a pattern overlay. And I could fill this with any kind of pattern I want. But I'll click cancel to keep the one that was there. The problem is when I warped this, that pattern is just a setting attached to the layer, and it warped the shape of the layer, but then that setting attached to the layer just updated, and it didn't get warped. So what I'm going to do is with that layer selected, I'm going to go to the layer menu, choose Smart Objects, and choose Convert to Smart Object. When I do that, watch what happens in the Layers panel. You notice that the part that's used to, if I choose Undo, say Pattern Overlay, seem to go away. It's not that it's gone, because if you look at it, you can still see the pattern applied to that object, but it's inside the Smart Object. And so therefore, Photoshop, as far as it's concerned, when it sees that layer, it can't see inside of it. If I warp and I use the same setting, which I think I used, I can't remember if it was arc or arch, but I'll use arc, you see that the pattern that is contained within that smart object is being bent along with the shape. So sometimes you're going to find that you need to put something into a smart object just to take some setting that's attached to it, like a filter, for instance, and get something else to be able to act upon it that usually it wouldn't. And this is one instance, which would be a pattern. Let's take an image here of a mug. What I would like to do here is take a photograph and act as if it's been printed onto the mug. So let's go find a photo to use. And this happens to be a raw file. Now with a raw file, I could just choose Open Image, it would open in Photoshop, and then I can convert it into a smart object. But there's a different thing I could do, which is look at the button at the bottom right of my screen that's called Open Image. And watch what happens to it if I hold down the Shift key. You notice it changes to Open Object. That means open this as a smart object. When I don't have Shift held down, it just says Open Image. So if I hold down Shift and I click where it says Open Object, now I'm opening that image as a smart object from the beginning. And in the case of a raw file, that's special. Because now when I double click on the thumbnail image for that smart object, instead of just opening another document that contains a picture, it's going to open Camera Raw. Because that's what we started with, was a raw file, and whenever you open a raw file, it shows Camera Raw, so you can adjust it. And therefore, I can make changes to this image when it comes to the brightness and the colors later on. I don't think we're going to utilize that in this particular example, but we will in a future one. Now I'm going to use the Move tool. I'm going to click within this document. I'm going to drag to the other document and make sure my mouse is contained within the document before I let go. Now I would like to take this and act it as if it's been wrapped around the mug. To do so, I'm first going to scale this down. So I'm going to type Command-T, that's Control-T in Windows, and that's the same as going to the Edit menu and choosing Free Transform. I'm going to make this just a little bit smaller so I can easily see the mug that's behind it. And then I'll return to the Edit menu. I'll choose Transform, and I'm going to warp this. Warping is going to allow me to bend it. Now this time, instead of choosing a preset warp, like what I did before from this menu, I'll leave it set to custom. And what I'll do is grab the 4 corners of the image one at a time and place them where I think it would be if this image was actually printed on the mug. I think this corner would be somewhere up this way. This one would be contained within the mug itself, and maybe down about there. This one's in a relatively good position to begin with. Then I'll grab this corner, drag it up, and I think it would be about there. After doing that, I'm going to click on the line that makes up the edge of the photograph, maybe right about in the middle, and see if it will allow me to move this around. It looks like it didn't like it when I was right on the line, so just need to be the tiniest bit below. And then here, I'll be just the tiniest bit above, and I'll drag down, trying to get the angle to look good. I can fine-tune where these corners are if need be. And these little handles that come off of the corners, they determine what angle the edge of the photograph will be at right when it leaves the corner. So if you point it straight down, the photo will go straight down immediately when it leaves that little corner point. If I were to move it this way, it would start going over towards the right. Well, I'm just going to tell that to mimic the edge of the mug, and I can do the same thing with the other one. I can also click on the left edge and pull it in or out if needed to bend it. And near the right edge as well if I needed to fine-tune it. But I'm just trying to get this to look like a reasonable idea of it being bent in here. You can also click in the middle and drag up and down if you need to reposition a portion of it. Maybe about like that. Then I'll press Return or Enter, and that doesn't really look like it's printed on the mug though, because the shading of the mug is not showing up. So I'm going to then go to my Layers panel, and I'll change the blending mode for this layer. We have a whole separate lesson on blending modes as part of Photoshop the Complete Guide, and in there you would learn that multiply mode acts like ink, and if so, it's going to be like printing this on the mug. And at any time, I can always go back to Edit, choose Transform, and choose Warp again, and it's going to act like I never left there, and I could fine-tune this as much as I want. Even after saving the image and closing the image, it can still be fine-tuned. All you got to do is reopen it. So I'll get that to be set up. Press Return or Enter, and let's just say that's good enough. But now I think the image looks a little on the dark side. I wish I would brighten it up. And it'd be best if I could brighten it up before I even opened it, like it's a raw file, right when I was in Camera Raw. Well, we can. Remember when we opened it, we double-clicked on it. It was a raw file. It brought us into Camera Raw. And right there, we had a button where we could open it as a smart object. So if I double-click on the thumbnail for this layer, watch what happens. It brings me into Camera Raw. Now, it doesn't show it to me on the mug, but I can come in here now and bring up the shadow slider, maybe bring up the overall exposure a little bit, and then I can click OK, and it updates. I think that's nice. All right, but then let's say that I took the original picture, I closed it, I'm not going to save the changes, and maybe for some odd reason I lost that file. I took this file, and in my case, I see if I can drag it to the trash. It's gone. Imagine I emptied my trash, and for some reason, that file I just lost track of. Well, at any time, you can take the contents of a smart object and have it literally generate a separate file of whatever's inside. And in this case, what's inside this layer is a raw file. So if I go to the layer menu and I choose Smart Objects, you're going to find a choice called Export Contents. And that means do the equivalent to double-clicking on the thumbnail for that layer, and whatever opens up, go to the File menu and choose Save As and make it a separate file. But in the case of a raw file, it's just going to spit out a brand new raw file. I choose Export Contents. I'm going to tell it to put it on my desktop. And up here, you can see it's going to be a raw file. So now if I look on my desktop, there's an extra file right there that I just generated, and it was taking it right out of the Smart Object. And I actually quite frequently use that because I'll create some sort of project that is complex and that might have something like this, and I might double click on this layer to change its name. And if I do, then it's going to be difficult for me to remember the name of that file, so that I might not know where it is. But it's just so easy to say Export Contents, and it will generate a new file. But the other thing I can do is if I have another file that happens to be the same size, then let's see if this will work. I'm not sure if I have one of the same size, but if I go to the Layer menu and I choose Smart Objects, there's also a choice called Replace Contents. And if I choose Replace Contents, I can come in here and try to find an image that would be a good replacement. No, not that one. Take me just a moment to see if I have one. Needs to be approximately the same dimensions, otherwise it's not going to line up. Let's try that one. I'm going to hit place. It's a raw file, so it brings up Camera Raw, but all I have to do is click OK. And now notice that it brought it in and it remembered the warping. It will remember any settings that were applied to it. But I can tell you that the file was slightly larger. That's because it's taking up more space here. They need to be the same pixel dimensions, the same number of pixels in the width and height in order to do that. But that means I can set up a template that does something complex, masking this picture, bending it, doing all sorts of things, and later on decide I'd like to use a different picture as long as that picture is of the same dimensions. Then let's say I need to write a book. I've done that many times, but it was a long time ago. You can see here, I wrote books back when Photoshop 6, not CS6, but 6 was out. And here's one for Photoshop CS2. But what happened when I wrote books is at the beginning of the book, in the introduction, I would always feature a picture of the actual book they were reading. Well, it's impossible to take a picture of a book before it's printed and insert it into the book that it shows in. So what I did is I made a mock-up, and this mock-up was just made in Photoshop, purely in Photoshop. The pages of the book, that's just running the filter called Add Noise, and then another filter called Motion Blur, which makes the specs go at an angle. That's what the pages are. But I would end up featuring the cover of the book. Well, the cover of the book gets designed and it shows up kind of like this. And I want to show you how I ended up transforming this into that mock-up of a book and how we can use that to maybe experiment with different book designs to decide which one we like. So here we have a book. This could be just a book you got from the bookstore, you slapped on a table and took a picture of, and we're just going to replace the cover. Then I'm going to go over here and get my mock-up for a book that I haven't written yet. This is a book I never wrote, but I was going to. And what I could do is take this document. There's a lot of layers in here because maybe there's a layer for each one of these pieces of text and one for the picture. Here's another picture I might decide to use and so on. And I'm just going to take all those layers and select them, and I'll say, convert to a smart object. And therefore, it's going to look like a single layer. Even though if I double click on the thumbnail for that layer, I'll get a brand new document that has all the original layers in it, so I can always go back and make changes. I'm going to then use the Move tool and drag this image over to the other document. Now that other document is in CMYK mode, so it's probably going to complain. Well, I'm surprised it didn't. And I get it over into this document, and now all I want to do is to transform it so that it can conform to the shape of this book. Now I do notice that the image that's in there, what happened is it doesn't just crop it to within the document's bounds. If there was any part of any layer that was pushed so it went beyond the bounds of the document, it includes that. So I see some extra space up here on top. I can always double click on that layer to see the original layers it was made from. Looks like this. And I could add a mask. In this case, I'm going to come in here and take me just a moment because I don't want that stuff sticking up. I'm going to put all this in a folder, and I'm going to put a mask on the folder. I'm just trying to get rid of the stuff that extends beyond the top and bottom. Like that, and fill with black on the outer part. Okay, I'm going to close that. It's going to ask if I want to save it. I'll say save. It'll save it right back to where it came from, which was that layer. And now that it doesn't extend beyond the edge, let's get it to conform to where the book was. It's a little on the big side, so I'm going to go and choose Free Transform. I'm going to bring in the handles, although I'm not sure why they go out quite that far. And what I could do to get this to show up in that other area is I can use something called distort. The way distort works is if you go to the Edit menu and you choose Transform, right here is a choice called Distort. And it will allow you to pull the four corners of an object and place them in different spots. Now usually this is going to show up right on the corners of the object you're working with. But my assumption is that that document here has other elements that are extending beyond the document's bounds. It's just on layers that are hidden. So let me show you what it would look like if I actually did that and I finished and it showed up in the right spot, because I did this ahead of time. There it is. If you just have a normal rectangular object, nothing fancy going on, and you choose Edit, Transform, Distort, you can grab the individual corners and reposition them. And I did that for both the cover of a book and its spine. Well, if those are smart objects, then if you want to edit the contents of the smart objects, maybe I want to go in here and change the color of these letters or type in different text or potentially change the picture. Well, all I do is I double click on the thumbnail for that particular layer and it shows up as a separate document. This is a different version of it because this one was made ahead of time. But here I could end up changing the photo that's there. I could come in and maybe in this case, I'll need to make a selection. If I can find my right selection tool here, I'll use the magic wand. This would usually be a type layer I could just change the color of, but in this case, this is just a screenshot of a book cover. And so I'm going to fill that, make it kind of crazy, wild thing. I'm going to close this and say save. And it's going to save it back to where it came from. Where did it come from? That layer, the layer I double clicked on. And it remembers all the transformations I've applied to it. It would remember any filters that were applied, any styles. It would remember all sorts of things. And I can make a mock-up of a book and later on decide which cover I'd like. Then I can double click on this again and I can say, well, maybe I want a different version. I can turn off some of these eyeballs. Here's a whole nother version. Close that, save, and it updates. So it can be very useful when creating mock-ups because you can later on make changes. Therefore, I need to make this book cover once, and as long as I used a smart object before I scaled down the cover, before I transformed it to get the corners in the right position, then I can easily double-click and change the contents and keep it as a nice little mock-up. Now let's explore the concept of using a raw smart object. I'm going to open a finished image first, and then I'll kind of give you an idea of how it was created. Here is my finished image, and the original version of this picture I really didn't like. Let's go back and look at it. I'll get rid of any settings that are attached to this so that you can see purely what the camera captured. This is what the original picture looked like. And to me, it looks dull. These areas on the side need to be brighter, need to be more vibrant. The sky, I wish, had detail. Down here where my wife is, I can barely see any detail in her face and in her pants. And I just really didn't like it. Well, it was a RAW file. So I double-clicked on the RAW file, which opened it in Adobe Camera Raw. And it decided I wanted to make the sky look better. So I did things like I brought the highlight slider down until the sky started to look good. But anytime you do that, anytime you adjust sliders like highlights, shadows, clarity, and dehaze, those 4 sliders have a tendency of creating halos, little glowy things. And I can start to see it right along here. You see it kind of looks like this is glowing, a brighter shade. I can also see it along here where it looks like a darker little halo there. So I might decide the highlight slider is not the best one to get the sky to be darker. Instead, if I brought exposure down, the entire picture would get darker along with it, and the sky would look good eventually, but I would avoid those halos. So I open the image. But when I open it, I don't open it normally. Not by clicking the Open Image button. I hold down the Shift key, knowing that it's going to change that button to Open Object. When I open it as an object, I know I'm going to have a smart object. And so if I have a smart object and I double-click on the thumbnail for it, if it was a RAW file that it contains, it should send me right back into Camera Raw so I can make additional changes. But I want to make changes that I can mask in using Photoshop's masking tools. So I want to duplicate that layer. There are many different ways of duplicating a layer. If I go to the Layer menu, right there is Duplicate Layer, or Layer New via Copy, or drag it down the New Layer icon. It doesn't really matter right now. But I'm going to double-click on the thumbnail for that copy of the layer. And I'm going to make a radical change to it. It's not actually going to be a change I desire. I just want to show you what's going to happen in Photoshop. When I click on OK, watch my Layers panel. Do you notice that both versions of the picture updated? It didn't just change the one I double-clicked on. It changed them both. And that's because anytime you duplicate a smart object, it thinks that you have multiple instances of the exact same content. Not dissimilar to if you're in a word processor or a page layout program, and you place a logo that's stored on your hard drive more than once. You just place the exact same file 2 or 3 times. Well, if it's linking back to the original contents and you make a change to that original contents, it might update all of those. We're going to get into that when it comes to it actually being a useful feature, but for now it's getting in our way. So I'm going to choose Undo by typing Command Z, and I'm going to throw away that top layer because we need to duplicate it in a special way. I'm going to choose Layer, Smart Objects, New Smart Object via Copy. The key word here is New. This means to create a new independent smart object that has no idea that it happened to be the same as another one that's contained within it. It's not thought of as being 2 instances of the same content. No. When I choose New Smart Object via Copy, it looks like I just duplicated the layer, but that layer is now independent of the one that's below it. Let's double check to be sure. I'll double click on the thumbnail for the layer. I'll change my exposure like I did before, click OK, and if you look in the Layers panel, you can now tell that that one is independent of this. I'll choose Undo because I didn't really want to make that change. And so remember, I did that by Layer, Smart Objects, New Smart Object via Copy. Now let's actually double click on it. And I'm going to optimize that for a different area. Let's say I'm going to optimize this one for the area where my wife is standing. So for that, maybe I need to brighten the image a bit. Maybe I want to lower the contrast a little. And maybe I want to bring out a little shadow detail. And I don't care what the rest of the picture looks like. Maybe adjust the white balance to warm up her skin a bit. And I'm going to click OK. Well, we have two versions of the image. One that looks good where the sky is, one that's going to look good where my wife is. So now I'm going to make a selection. Let's say I made a selection here of where the sky is. And I need to take away the area where my wife is because it got that selected. And imagine I spent the time, which I'm not going to do right now, to get a relatively accurate selection around her. Well, now I'm going to get the opposite of that because I'm going to use the sky from the image that's underneath, and I'll add a layer mask. A layer mask is only going to keep the areas that are selected. The only area that's selected currently is everything that's not the sky and the mountain behind. So now that could be put in. Now, if you followed our advanced masking session, you could figure out how to touch up this selection over here, because this is no different than working on a bird's wing where you might end up with a selection that's inaccurate, but we could get that to be accurate. And what I would end up doing here is simply duplicating this multiple times, each time making sure it's creating a new smart object, and then masking where I need to use each version. I've already done that in a separate document, so I'm going to close this one. I just wanted to make sure you knew how I got to there, and I want to show you the end result. Here's the end result. And I actually interpreted the settings for this file a total of 5 times. Let's turn off all those different versions, get to the base image. Here's the first version of the image. And so let's say we're going to use that version just for where these vines are. We're in a vineyard here. And I wasn't concerned with what Karen looked like. I wasn't concerned with what the sky looked like. I was just trying to get the vines to look good. Then I said new smart object via copy. And I ended up processing the image again. And this time I did it for Karen's skin. And I'll put that in here. This one was actually done near the end, so it could be put in underneath because it would be covered up already. So here the masking didn't have to be precise. I can show you that at the end. For now, let me turn that off. Then the next one up was for just Karen's pants. Because she's wearing black pants, it was next to impossible to see any detail in it, so I processed the image just so you can see a little detail. The one above that was just for her shirt. And I went into Camera Raw and adjusted it until I thought her shirt looked good. The one on top is used up there where it's not red, and that was for the sky. Put in like that. And then working a little bit lower than this, if I hide the very bottom layer just so you can see, that's what's used on the upper layers, and you can see little holes where her hands are and things. If I were to put something underneath here to fill in those areas, that's where I did. Since that was put on later on, it didn't need to be masked quite as precisely. But it all depends if you know how to think about layer masks and masking. So this is a total of 5 different Camera Raw settings applied to the exact same image, and then using masks, I combined them together. And being able to use a smart object made it so I could duplicate the layer into a new smart object, double click on it, and apply different Camera Raw settings. Repeat the process over and over again, and use layer masks to control where they show up. After doing that, I ended up doing a little bit of retouching, so if I turn on the layer above, you just see like a yellow flower at the bottom going away and a few other little distractions. And then I ended up applying some adjustments. And so here's what happens after I adjust the picture. That's like what you would learn in the tonal adjustments lesson or the color adjustments lesson to put this image together. But one of the key elements of pulling it off was the use of a raw file loaded as a smart object, and then duplicating it into a new smart object with that special command, which is layer, smart objects, new smart object via copy. And that's what I'll often need to do to optimize a picture where I can't get it to look satisfactory using a single set of camera raw settings. Now let's take a look at the concept of multiple instances of the exact same smart object. We saw just a hint of it when we worked with a raw file. Do you remember when I just used standard commands to duplicate a layer? How if I'd made a change to one smart object, the other one updated? Well, let's see how that can be a useful feature. In this document, I have drawn two layers here. I drew a base, which is just a circle. And after making that circle, I added a drop shadow so that if I turn off the drop shadow, you can see that it's gone. Then above that, I ended up drawing this polygon. Now both of those can be drawn using what's known as the shape tools. And we had a lesson in the Ultimate Guide that covered the use of the shape tools, and I ended up making a complex gear, but this is just using two of these particular tools. I simply drew an ellipse on one layer, and I drew a polygon on the other. So I'm going to select those two layers, and I'm going to turn them into a smart object. That's going to look as if those two layers get merged into one. It still has access to the individual layers, though. I just need to double-click on the layer to get them to show up as a separate document. Now I'm going to end up duplicating that layer multiple times. You can duplicate it any way you'd like, as long as I don't use the command we used on the raw file that made the other layer independent. Now, a quick way of duplicating a layer is when you're using the Move tool and you click and drag to move a layer. If you hold down the Option key, that's Alt in Windows, you're going to move a copy. And so here I just made a copy. Then I'm going to select both of the layers that have bolts in them in my Layers panel. And with the Move tool again, I'm going to hold down the Option key once again to make another set of copies. And if you want to, we could make a ridiculous number just by holding Option each time I drag and dragging out a bunch of these. Like if that's a panel that's really bolted down well. Now if you look in our Layers panel, you're going to see a whole bunch of layers. Each one of them, except for that bottommost layer, is a smart object. Now I'm going to double-click on any one of those layers on its thumbnail image. It doesn't matter which of the layers because they're all point back to the same original contents. When I double-click on the thumbnail for the layer, that contents appears as its own layer, and that's where I can see it here. I can tell that it's just a little circle and a polygon above it. We could fine-tune it. Maybe I add some additional styles, a bevel and embossed around the edge, a little gradient overlay to add some shading. Maybe on my polygon, I come in here and add a little edging on there with some bevel and emboss and some other things. Those are just things I had turned off, but I could have just added them by coming down here and saying I want to add bevel and emboss and such. Anyway, I just updated that. Now I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to close this. And when I close it, since I made changes, it's going to ask if I want to save them. I'll say yes, save them. And it's going to save them back to where they came from. Where they came from is wherever I double-clicked to get this document to appear, which means it's going to go back into the layer that it came from, and all of these just updated. If I choose undo, you'll see what they used to look like, and then I'll reapply, and you can see the update. So therefore, if you ever want to use an element multiple times in a document, and later on you might want to update that element, you might want to change its contents, change its color or anything else, if you end up turning it into a smart object before you duplicate to use it in multiple areas of the image, you're going to have much more versatility. We'll show you another example of that. Let's say you're doing web design. Here's your interface you're going to have to navigate your website. And you see you have those little circles that are kind of like little bullets to indicate where your various options. Well, if you made one of those and you turn it into a smart object before you duplicated it to do the others, which was done here, then you should be able to take one of those layers like this one. Do you see the one that's turning on and off? And double click on its thumbnail. And then you're going to see that as a separate document. There it is. Well, I'm going to go over to the other document we were working on, this one, and I'm going to double click on one of these layers. So I'm just going to grab these two pieces. And I'll use my move tool, drag it over to this document and put it in there. It's a little on the large side, so I might type Command T for transform. Just get it to be an appropriate size. Press Return or Enter, and then hide the layer that contains the original piece. I'm going to close that. Tell it yes, save the difference, save that, and we'll close the one I took it from. Now let's return and see what we have. Look, they're all now little bolts. Since it was in a different position, it wasn't centered in the document, it got moved up a little bit here. They're still in the same position, it's just before the object was centered in the document, and when I was done, it was higher in the document. So all I need to do here is grab all those layers and use the arrow key to move down with my move tool. I could do the same thing with these tabs, as long as when I made one tab, I turned it into a smart object before duplicating it to create the others. And that was the case here. If I double click on this, there's my tab. And that tab is made out of just a shape with a bunch of layer styles on it. But I could change its appearance here. And then if I close this and save the changes, all of them will update. But what if I only wanted one of them to update? Well, that's when I need to come in here and choose Layer, Smart Objects, New Smart Object via Copy, which means make a smart object that is independent of the existing ones. I would do that, and then I would throw away the layer that it was made from. So that now that one on the left is completely independent, I can double click on its thumbnail and I'll turn back on those styles, close it and save it. And now you can see that only one of them changed. And that's because I took only one of them and said new smart object via copy. I threw away the layer that that new smart object was generated from, and now that one's independent of the others. So there's all sorts of uses for this. You could end up, if you make advertisements, you're going to have a coupon border around it. You start off with just dashes in your coupon border. Well, just make one dash, turn it into a smart object, and then carefully duplicate it and space it out all the way around your document. Later on, the next week, you decide, I want to have stars all the way around. All you have to do is double click on the thumbnail for that layer, replace the dash with a star, suddenly they all update. There's all sorts of uses for that, but it's known as multiple instances of the same smart object. All right, now let's look at how I took that to another level. Here I'm going to turn off a bunch of layers to show you just one layer. This single layer was created using the shape tools. I demonstrated how to use the shape tools in a separate lesson that was about the tools and panels in Photoshop. So if you haven't seen that lesson, you might want to refer to it. And then this was just a solid color, and it only has some effects applied to it to give it a special look. If I turn off the effects, you can see it's just a boring solid color. To change its basic color, I went down to the letters FX, and there's a choice called Color Overlay. In that color overlay, I chose red. And that's what made it look red. I got to turn all these on to show it to you, though. Okay, there's the red. Then I went back to the same menu and I decided to add a drop shadow. There it is. Then I decided to add bevel and emboss and something else called satin. That's what makes it look special. Now, what if before adding all of those settings to this, instead, back when it looked like the simple shape, I turned it into a smart object? Well, if that's the contents of the smart object, and then on the outside of the smart object, I added those effects, then those effects can easily be changed. Then I end up taking this and I duplicate it. I can just type Command J, that's one way of duplicating, and then I can transform it with free transform. And I think in one of the other lessons in the complete guide, I showed you how you could rotate something. Well, what if I were to rotate this until that little hook around the edge here seemed to wrap right around? Actually, right there. And I press Return or Enter to say I'm done. Then there's a way to get it to do that again. And again, I could repeat this. I've already done that, which is what created all of these pieces. And I showed that process where you can duplicate and you can rotate from the middle of the document instead of the middle of the object in the lesson that had to do with tools and panels. So if you need more about how to do that, feel free. That's not really what I wanted to show you. I just needed to talk a little bit about the setup for this document. Now, since I had a shape and I turned it into a smart object before I duplicated it, before I rotated it, all that rotation and other changes are going to be retained if I come in here and just double click on the thumbnail for that layer. There's the original shape. If I come in and use this little arrow tool that's known as the direct selection tool, I could select part of this and see about changing it. And if I close it and save it, it just updated every single one of those. I'll choose undo, before, after. So it just makes it so you can push it to an extreme if you want to, and I did it when I created some pieces of interesting kind of art with this, because it allowed me to create something like this and to make fine-tune adjustments. Like for instance here, if you see how this particular piece looks almost like it's wrapping right around that edge, and this looks like it's almost going perfectly around that. Well, that's because I was able to adjust it and have all these update and just do it multiple times until I got it to be exactly the way I wanted to. Then after I was done with that, I made it look like these were woven, as if this piece went above here and then underneath and above and underneath and above and so on. But I showed that in the layer mask lesson. So it's only if you get the full complete guide that you'll learn how to do all that stuff. Then I own a bus, a vintage bus. This is what it looks like. And at the time I got the bus, it was painted blue and white, and I knew I was going to repaint it. Well, the factory, back when they made these buses, which my bus is made in the 60s, but they made these buses all the way back to like the late 1930s. Well, what they used to do is give you this little paint sheet where, if I turn off one of these designs, it was just an empty sheet like this. You can grab a marker and design your paint job. And so when I had my bus originally, I used these sheets and I drew on them all sorts of different designs to try to figure out what design might I want. But the problem was just seeing it here in these three views was not sufficient for me to feel confident it would look good on my bus. So I took a picture of my bus. And back at the time I took the picture, it didn't quite look like that. It looked like a blue and white bus, which is this. That's what it looked like when I bought it. I ended up modifying that to try to make it look like a white bus. And I just made areas black and white, and then I brightened them to the same brightness. That's what I have as the base of this document. Then let me show you how I use smart objects to create a mock-up of my bus. Well, I took this paint sheet and I loaded it as a smart object. Now, there's a couple different ways of making things into a smart object. So far, I've shown you that you could take existing layers, select them, go to the Layer menu, and choose Smart Object, convert to Smart Object. But another thing you can do is, let me just close this document. I can go to the File menu, and there's a choice right here called Open as Smart Object. And if I choose Open as Smart Object, then I could find that file in my hard drive. And I wish I would have looked at the name of it, but it's one of these. Take me just a moment to find it. It's in here somewhere. There it is. And I can choose Open. And now it comes in, and it's a smart object, but it originated as a file. So that's just another way of doing it. I'm going to drag that over to the other tab, bring it in here, and then I could scale this and distort it until it matched the bus that's in there. What I would do is, in the lesson about blending modes, you'd learn that multiply mode acts like ink, and so I'd use that mode. I type Command T, and let me see if I can get this to approximate what I did. I would need to do some further adjustment, but I did it. I'm going to throw away this layer, though, and turn on the one I actually did. There it is. So now what I was able to do is to double-click on this layer, the one that's a smart object, and I saw the original document here. And I could draw my own paint job. And I drew one there, and I decided maybe this is an alternative, or this is an alternative, or this is an alternative. And if I were to turn one of those on, all I need to do is close this document, tell it to save it, and it saved it right back into the other file, and I could preview it there right on the bus. And that allowed me to experiment enough with various designs till I came up with this one that I liked. And it gave me more confidence. I don't say this is the cleanest version of it, but the main thing is smart objects made it possible. So I use smart objects for so many things that it's somewhat absurd. But it takes time to get your brain around it. The main thing to remember is that anytime you create a smart object, however many layers you have in your layers panel are going to look like they merged into one. But what they really did is they got transferred into a separate hidden document that you can only access if you double-click on the thumbnail for the layer, and if you do, it shows up in a separate window. Then anything you do to that layer, any transforming, scaling, warping, filtering, is something that's not permanent, something you can easily turn off or change the settings on. And if you duplicate it so you have more than one version of it, it's really multiple instances of the same content. So if we change one, they all update. And to me, it makes it so Photoshop can become dramatically more versatile, but you also then have to think through what's really happening a little more than usual. But I hope with a little bit of experimentation that you can get comfortable with smart objects.